So we come now to this last section of this third lecture about Michael Herr. And this section will appear to be a little bit of an oddball in the sense that it seems to be separate. It actually opens out into a whole discussion about these three things: weapons, combat, and sex, to the extent that the next course that I teach about war, which is killer culture, really focuses on, in many ways, these things and the construction of masculinity and femininity and gender and overall and politics and so on. And so that's really that's where this points in that direction. Some of the texts we deal with in this course take up this definition, or not definition so much as the discussion of gender, particularly the stuff that's in the second part of the course. The Hurt Locker does, and so does American Sniper. And also so does Where Do We Go From, or Where Do We Go Now? Et Maintenant, Ava. Yeah. So, but this little piece comes from Herr, and there are some famous mentions of gender and sexuality in Herr, which I think you have to acknowledge are there, and you have to deal with them, because this was a book written by a young man who is going to, as much as he is enormously critical is wrong, but astute and alert to what's going on in the war, he also makes gender connections which are very much part of his time. I mean, he is also part of the 70s, the 60s and the 70s. So anyway, one of the things what this section does is connect this last point about mastery with weapons to the destruction of the jungles around them, and the jungles are basically impossible to fight in using traditional tactics. And so he says on page 152, where we're going with this is that you can begin to see the jungles as an expression of, this is very common in both British and North American visions of nature, that nature is female, and that the urge to destroy it or dominate it is male. And so that the wiping out of the jungles in Vietnam using Agent Orange and other defoliants, part of that could be. I mean, I certainly wouldn't rule it out at all. So when he decimated them, broke them, burned parts of them so that nothing would ever live on them again, it must have given a lot of Marines a good feeling, an intimation of power. They'd humped those hills until their legs were in agony. They'd been ambushed them and blown apart on their trails, trapped on their barren ridges, lain under fire clutching the foliage, on 152. So here's this, ultimately you want revenge, not against just the people of Vietnam, but against the country itself, which has tortured you. Never underestimate the confusion of sex and killing in the American mythos. And this goes for other famous militaries, particularly the Germans in World War II, who had a very distinct and screwed up is sort of the quickest way of putting it, but recognizable for sure for us way of understanding gender and power and so on. Well, Herr isn't alone in understanding power and machinery, in this case, chemical defoliation and sexuality. And the little ships that he talks about, these are loaches. A loach is a small two-man helicopter, which they didn't have any guns usually, and they look like dragonflies. They have these sort of bubbles, and and they're very quick. Those little ships, Loaches, were the most beautiful things flying in Vietnam. They just hung there above those bunkers like wasps outside a nest. That's sex, the captain said. That's pure sex on 160. So when he describes moving into combat, Herr makes a very famous and unhappy connection for a lot of people. And as I say, you have to acknowledge that this is there. So you're talking about combat and the experience of the person, any person who goes into combat. You were just like everyone else. You could no more blink than spit. It came back the same way every time, dreaded and welcome. Balls and bowels turning over together, your senses working like strobes, free falling all the way down to the essences. And every time you were so weary afterward, so empty of everything but being alive that you couldn't recall any of it. It was the feeling you'd had when you were much, much younger and undressing a girl for the first time. Okay, so again, this is one of these discussions which what the person describes, what people describe going into combat is certainly this kind of, it's being overwhelmed, and understandably. And one of the things that professional soldiers or soldiers who are have become functional on the battlefield or able to function under fire is that they are no longer overwhelmed by it. They are able to function in this environment. And that's not a lot of people. I mean, most people cannot. And so he describes this, complete, the system is lit up like a pinball machine, basically. It's just, everything's going off, and lights and sounds and so on. And then afterward, there's this sort of, you can see where the sex stuff comes in, because it's basically sort of this post-sex sort of experience of being, you just had a major adrenaline, your body uses all the adrenaline that it's got, and then there's nothing left. And so there's a terrible crash. Well, before the crash, which the soldiers many record, there's this sort of blissful floating experience. And so you can see the obvious connections to sex. And Herr makes that connection, right? That this is like your first sexual experience, or the potential of it. So the idea is that somehow war is the next forbidden thing. That sex has been forbidden, and you become an adult when it's no longer forbidden, and then war is the next forbidden thing after that. This is the final forbidden thing. This is the real reality, that you've been waiting for. Let me just add a couple of notes here about this. Why is this problematic? It's problematic because for male soldiers, anyway, obviously, connecting combat and sex means that we arrive in territory that was explored during World War I. The Germans actually have a word for it, Lustmord, where there's this combination of sex and death. And so when I talk about these sort of two levels of what's forbidden, sex is forbidden because somehow the experience of orgasm presumably frees you from it entirely overcomes reason, and is embodied experience, an embodied experience. And then you get to war, and you get to kill people, and you get to kill people legally. The problem that we've got, is that what happens when killing becomes a sexual thrill, or when you have to kill to essentially have the experience of sex. So you're no longer interested in sex, you just want to kill people. Or what if the two come together, which I can't remember now whether I have talked about this, somewhere in here I have or will. where I talk about the men talking about themselves as being double veterans. In Vietnam, to be a double veteran meant you raped somebody and then you killed them, which happened in My Lai, where there were many, which I will again talk about, where there were many rapes and many deaths. So that's sort of I think it wasn't the reason I'm adding this is that I don't think it was initially that clear about this, and so I'm now spelling it out because it seemed to me to be a bit coy. I was like, come on, Tim, let's talk about the real thing. This is a serious goddamn problem. If men understand the real reality to be at war, and they understand that the performance of power is through rape and murder, then we have got a seriously screwed up worldview if it's formed like that. And then you've got people who come home and train their sons to act this way, which is what you see in American Sniper. And there are direct contacts between killing and between killing and sexuality or erections and so on. Any sort of male demonstration of sexual prowess, which, if you really want to look at this, it's exhaustively examined in Dr. Strangelove, where the whole thing is basically about, the missiles are every single missile and every single weapon, including the bombers, are all penises, basically all phalluses flying around. But, so Kubrick, this has been long covered. But here is Herr covering it, and this is one of the problems with this text, is that he's kind of not really judgmental about it. He's like, and that's okay. It's like, no, it's not okay. But so the issue really is, and this is one of these things where people will, pick on this and they'll say, yeah, but there's this passage in Dispatches. It's like, that's true. There is this passage, and it is deeply problematic. At the same time, it probably is also true about, at the time, certainly the male experience of going to war. And whether these things have been unhooked, I'm not convinced at all that weapons have been unhooked from masculinity. If they had been, I don't think that men in the South, particularly the South and the West, and the middle of America, would be so insane about their damn guns. But the reason the NRA is so strong, and the National Rifle Association, and the reason that the Second Amendment is so feared, I think, is because men understand the removal of guns as their emasculation. It's not really that complex. They're going to defend it in all kinds of other bullshit ways, but fundamentally, this is absolute nonsense. Okay, now we are ready to conclude. Okay. What did we see today? Today we saw... I'm smalling myself so you can actually get this stuff down. All right, so I'll pause. I'll let you pause me. All right. And then, okay, so let me come back to this. Let me talk about these a little bit. One's culture defines ethical actions. We assume, I think most cultures assume that the way they do things is the way things should be done. That this is, we arrived at this. We didn't arrive at this by accident. We came here, basically, we arrived at sort of the system of norms and cultural expectations that we have over the course of a long time. This is the way things should be, and everybody else is kind of a little crazy for doing things their way, and we're glad to get back to our own countries eventually and say, well, this is the way reality should be. So that what comes with that is ethics, and the idea that there is an ethical norm that all people recognize all this is the good. It's like, no, that's part of this assumption that there is a way of seeing the world. Okay, so we have to let go of that. Then these actions may include colonial, racist, and imperial violence, which means that this may just be the way things are done. And now that doesn't mean that you then say about that, oh well, you say no, that's we're going to change that. We got to get after that. We got to fix that. No, this is unacceptable. The point is that you have to be aware of what the norms are, what the accepted actions are, and then say, well, wait a second, we came here to help people, and we turned out, we wound up killing more of them than we helped, quote unquote, if we helped them. Is this really, is that ethical? Is this our definition of ethics? Like, oh, we've got a problem, we've got a paradox here, we better fix that. Okay, if the nation's belief in itself is strong enough, this is where we're going. This is where we were in Vietnam, where basically the white population, but also the African American population, basically said about the war, well, we have to stop communism. And if to stop communism, we have to break a few eggs, to, mix metaphors here, to make this particular omelet, well, okay, that's what we have to do. And if, of course, as long as it happens to somebody else, not as long as it happens to us. So this is the idea that, basically the ends justify the means, so on. All right. And then male violence and war is often inextricably tangled up with sexuality. This is something which I'm pointing to here because I don't want you to miss it, as if you could possibly miss it, really, in this particular world. Okay. All right. I will see you, as they say, on the other side.